Good afternoon, and welcome to the Douglas County Racial and Ethnic Disparities, also known as RED Virtual Conference. My name is LaDonna Jones Dunlap, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Subcommittee. Before we begin, I would like to give a special thank you to the Separate Juvenile Court of Douglas County, Nebraska, the Honorable Vernon Daniels. A thank you to CEO and President of the Urban League of Nebraska, Mr. Thomas Warren Sr., and a thank you to Douglas County Commissioner Chris Rogers. These individuals continue to provide unwavering support for our RED efforts. An additional thank you to the Nebraska Juvenile Justice Association for their partnership in making this virtual platform possible. Before we move into housekeeping items, we like to survey the room and see who's joining us today. And always appreciate you taking the time to join us over the noon hour. A few housekeeping items. All participants have been placed on mute. If you have a question for our presenter, please enter it into the chat box. We will monitor questions as they come in and get to as many as time permits after the presentation. For purposes of CEUs, if you are viewing this presentation in a room with others, please make sure to type your name and email address into the chat box to receive your certification. Certificates will be mailed out later this week. For legal personnel seeking CLEs, please contact Attorney Services. As a reminder, at the end of this presentation, during the closing remarks, we ask you complete a brief survey about the presentation. Your input is valuable to us, and we thank you in advance for completing it. Now I will turn it over to Shelley Salter, our Douglas County Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative Coordinator, also known as JDI.
Thank you, LaDonna. Welcome, everyone. Today we are welcoming to Nebraska Seema Gajwani. Seema presented at a JDI conference in Seattle about a year and a half ago, where some of us were first introduced to her and the work she does in the area of restorative justice. Her passion for our youth, our work, and the reform of systems is contagious. Seema is on vice chair of the board of the Pretrial Justice Institute. She is special counsel for the Juvenile Justice Reform at the District of Columbia Office of the Attorney General. She has been in the role of public defender at the DC Public Defender Services, where she represented kids and adults defendants in trial. In the past, she has run the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Program at the Public Welfare Foundation, focusing on efforts to reduce incarceration rates across the nation. There is much more to Seema's bio that I could possibly give you all today. She sent us a list of some reference materials that are pertinent to the presentation and discussion today. Those have been uploaded to the NJJA website. So take a look at those and other materials from other conference sessions that we have there. We are thrilled to bring to you all this message of restoration today. We hope you enjoy and help me in welcoming Seema Gajwani. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley and Ms. Dunlap. I really appreciate this, and I'm honored to be here today to speak to you all. Thank you so much for having me. I should start by saying that I'm here to talk to you about restorative justice, but that I actually didn't know much about restorative justice only like 6 years ago. And what I did know about it, I was very skeptical about. As Shelley mentioned, I currently work for the DC Office of the Attorney General. But before that, I worked at a foundation. And my time at the foundation on criminal and juvenile justice, I really focused on data collection and risk assessment and recidivism. I was drawn to kind of hard analytical stuff. And when I learned about restorative justice, I thought it was soft and idiosyncratic and difficult to scale and expensive to evaluate. And I also couldn't imagine why a victim would agree to do restorative justice. So I didn't know much about it, and I was skeptical about it, probably like many of you. And then one day at my new job at the DC Office of the Attorney General, I was at Ballou Senior High School, which is a large public school in Washington, DC. And a woman named Ivy Hilton was there, and she was holding a restorative justice conference or circle, and she invited me to watch. And it was about a fight that had happened between two high school students a few days before, but it really actually wasn't much of a fight. It was like one kid just beating the lights out of another kid in a classroom, punching the other boy in the face repeatedly until a teacher just pulled him off of the other boy. Like I said, it had been a couple of days. This happened, I think, on a Friday, and I was at the school on a Monday morning. But when the smaller boy walked into the conference room that I was in, you could still see on his face like the swelling and a little bit of blood red in the white part of his eye. I'll call him Darren for privacy. So Darren, his mom, and his aunt came in first, and they were talking about how bad Darren's face had looked on Friday. They were angry, they were upset. Darren was quiet. And then soon the other high school boy came in. I'll call him Malik for the purposes of this talk. And he came in with his mother and his mother's fiance. And the restorative justice facilitator, Ivy, she asked us all to sit on chairs that were arranged in a circle with no table in the middle, and had us all go around and introduce ourselves, and then stated some ground rules. Technology. After she talked about ground rules, she turned to Malik and she said, Malik, tell us what happened. Now, I should say also that when I first looked at the scene, it was pretty clear to me what happened. Malik was a bigger boy. He was taller. He was thicker. And Daryl was small. And so it seemed like a big kid beat up a small kid. Like that's the end of the story. But then Malik started to talk. And when he spoke, he was really, really soft in his voice. He was kind of hunched over and nervous and embarrassed and quiet. And he kept saying my name. They all did. They kept saying my name, but it wasn't my name. It was something else. So evidently, they had been making fun of his name, and they'd been needling him for weeks. And I guess this was the last straw. So the facilitator, Ivy, she turned to Darren, the other little boy, and she said, Darren, tell the group what happened. Nothing, he said. I just said his name, and he came out of nowhere and he started punching me in the face. That's what Darren said. And then the facilitator asked the group to go around and say what we all heard Darren saying and what it made us think about from our own experience. And so one of the adults in the room, I don't remember whose parent it was, said, I don't think Darren is telling quite the full story. And then another person said, when I was a young person, people used to make fun of my name, and I found it really hurtful, and it made me very angry. And then it came around to Darren's mom. And Darren's mother said, Darren is a joker. He thinks he's so funny. He likes to joke around, but he doesn't appreciate how he can hurt people and how he could maybe get hurt himself. And so like that, we continued to talk in this circle. And we talked for an hour and a half. And both the mothers talked about the fact that they didn't raise their children like this and how much they disliked violence. Malik's mother talked about how she works 2 jobs and she has to take the bus, and how she had to miss work on Friday when she got the call from the school. And then she had to miss work again today on Monday to come to the school, and how her boss was mad. When Darren's mom spoke, she looked at him and she said, people look at Black boys in Southeast DC and they assume that they're violent. But she knew that her son was not a violent kid. And she said, I just don't want you to end up dead or a number. And she starts crying. And the circle goes on, and both the parents apologized to the other parents for what their son had done. Malik's mother said to Darren's mother, if I see you on the street, you'll know that you'll have a friend. She said, I heard a lot of rumors about what happened in this fight since Friday in the neighborhood. I heard that the boy called my son a bee, about how your family was bringing their people to this meeting. She said, I woke up this morning and I said, Lord, help me. I'm going down to Baloo to brawl today. And that's why I brought my fiance. But now, she said, I see that we've made friends, and I don't think this should have happened, but I want to thank these boys because it's brought our families together. Now, both the boys were super uncomfortable. It was really hard for Malik to admit what he'd done to the person who he had hurt in front of this group of his family and Darren's family. And Darren was forced to admit the role that he and his friends had played in taunting Malik. And it also seemed like the boys weren't used to hearing their moms talk about them and their hopes and their fears. And so when the moms got emotional, you could see on the faces of the boys the pain that they were feeling watching their moms cry. And so the adults around the circle, this community itself, not Ivy, the facilitator, and not me, they talked to Malik about how violence was not appropriate, but they also expressed empathy and compassion towards him. And Malik's mother's fiance told the group at one point that in some of his free time, he goes to the boxing gym and he offered to take the boys there together to channel their anger in a positive way. And later we learned he did that. And Darren's aunt, who was also there, she said at some point to Darren, "What are you going to do the next time your friends want to tease Malik?" And he was like, "It'll be fine, don't worry." But she didn't let it go. She said, "No, pretend I'm your friend." And I say, "Hey, Darren, come on, let's do this. What are you going to say?" "Not," he responds, and he's in character. "It's not like that. He's cool. Leave him alone. We've settled it." And so they go back and forth and they practice how Darren is going to deal with his friends in the future. And towards the end of the conference, the boys each apologized to each other, and Ivy made them do it twice. She said, "I want you to do it with eye contact." You know how teenagers are. But the group came to an agreement about what Malik and Darren had to do. Each promise was written down and the group signed the document. They talked about how they would behave when they saw each other in school again. They talked about what they were going to say to their friends when their friends asked them about what happened, how they would talk about this incident going forward on social media. And then that was it. We all got up, the moms hugged, the kids did that shoulder thing pre-COVID, and then everyone left. But me, I was floored because Darren was hurt. He had injuries. And in Washington, D.C., Malik would have been charged with an assault. And as Shelley mentioned, I'd been a public defender in D.C. for 6 years. And so I know what would have happened to Malik had he gone to court because many of my clients went through this. After the fight at school, a court Malik would have been questioned and handcuffed and arrested. He would have been taken overnight probably, and then held in court the next day in cell block for hours until his case was called. And for a few minutes during this time, he'll be visited by a court-appointed lawyer, somebody like me, the defense attorney, asking about the details of his life and the details of the crime. Now, to court Malik, his lawyer is the one person who knows the worst of what he's done. And this is what she'll say to him: "We can beat this. The government's evidence isn't that strong. Just don't admit that you ever did anything. Don't tell anybody about any of this, and let me do all the talking." And as defense attorneys, we need to do this because we're trying to build trust quickly and show our client and their family that we're on their side. We're investing into a bank account that will pay us back later when we have to have hard conversations about trial and plea offers. But we're also inadvertently undermining what the research shows is fundamental to a child changing their behavior, and that is taking responsibility for their actions. Now, eventually, Malik's case would be called in court, and a judge and a prosecutor, the probation officer, and a defense attorney will all discuss his fate. And none of these people know Malik or his family. To them, court Malik will have been what they read about on the police report and what I first saw when I met Malik, a large teenage boy who violently assaulted a smaller kid in his class. It's an assault, it's violent, it's a poor Black boy. We've seen this story before. And the prosecutor and the judge will never hear about Malik's struggles in school as a painfully shy kid, about the fact that he lost his father when he was 8 years old and that he takes good care of his sister, things that we learned in this circle. The prosecutor will look at court Malik and he will think about Darren, the victim. And as a prosecutor, it's his job to do justice for the victim, Darren, and his mother and the community. And so he will prosecute fully. And back in the courtroom, a probation officer will stand up and read off all of the worst things about Court Malik to everyone in the courtroom. Details that maybe his mom reported at intake when she was trying to process what had happened and why this happened, in tears. Probation officer will report mediocre grades, spotty school attendance, might be hanging out with the wrong crowd. For Malik, at his age, who he is and what he thinks of himself is inordinately influenced by what others think of him. He may look tough and hardened, but Malik's self-esteem is fragile and his development, psychological development, is vulnerable. And in a courtroom, wearing a jumpsuit, silenced, ashamed, Court Malik will hear what others think of him, other adults, in front of his mom, who's sitting behind helpless. I believe that we contribute to stigmatizing these kids in courtrooms all over our country because we believe that they believe what we've told them about themselves, that they are broken, that they are bad, that they are unforgivable. And then we blame them for it. Eventually, Court Malik will enter a guilty plea. The plea will happen after negotiation between lawyers. The prosecutor will subconsciously transfer his distrust of the defense attorney to Court Malik and assume that Court Malik is manipulative and lacks remorse and is indifferent about what he did. Because the prosecutor will never know that Malik felt terrible after what he did, that he would have taken responsibility for the fight on the first day of court if he could have. But at no point will Malik ever have to apologize to Darren. Darren won't have to apologize for his role, however minor. And when the judge asks him if he committed the crime, Malik's lawyer will lean over to her client, as I did with mine, and whisper in his ear and advise him to say yes in order to take the plea. None of this feels like accountability. And to the victim, none of this will probably feel like justice either. And worse, Court Malik will return to school, and the underlying problem between him and Darren will not have been addressed. In fact, now Darren and his friends may be emboldened or preparing for retaliation. And Malik will have been the kid who was locked up, who has a probation officer, who is a criminal. And it turns out that the very nature of our adversarial justice process produces a Court Malik who now comes out more wounded, angrier, and actually more likely to harm again. And we've all seen this happen. But none of this actually did happen. What actually happened is that in this matter, two boys and their families resolved the whole issue with accountability and fairness in a 1.5 hour conversation. And so you see why I was floored when I watched this. Now I work at the Office of the Attorney General for the District of Columbia, and we are the exclusive prosecutor for all juvenile crime in Washington, D.C. And in 2017, DC Attorney General Karl Racine launched this restorative justice program. And since then, we have full-time restorative justice facilitators in-house, and we have brought together victims of crime and offenders and their families and supporters for over 165 restorative justice circles. We call them conferences. We have successfully used restorative justice in stabbing cases, in carjackings, in burglaries, all instead of traditional prosecution. For a while, our most common case was a simple assault or a low-level robbery. But today we are focusing on serious violent crime because mostly our office diverts the low-level offenses to treatment through our public health system. So now our restorative justice program has caseloads that consist of robberies, gun offenses, and even serious assaults. Now, I should say that restorative justice doesn't always work. First, we only go forward with victim permission. So if a victim says they're not interested, then we don't do restorative justice, and the case is handled in the traditional manner by our traditional prosecutors. And in the case where we do go to restorative justice and we go to a conference and it doesn't work out, either the young person doesn't stick to the agreement that he promised to, or he doesn't show up to the conference and participate. In those cases, the case gets handed back to the prosecutor, and then the prosecutor continues with traditional prosecution. But of all of the 165 restorative justice conferences that we've had, only 9 have been returned for prosecution total. Some victims choose to participate in restorative justice because they are generous and charitable, and they don't want to ruin a kid's life. But some victims choose restorative justice even though they're really angry, because they need something that the court process doesn't give them. They have to walk around in the world and may be worried about seeing the person who hurt them, or they may be worried about retaliation after prosecution. But often also they want to tell the young person and their family how much they were hurt. And they want to see for themselves if he's truly sorry for what he did. Some victims are baffled about why this happened, and they have lots of questions. They're worried about why they were maybe targeted, or they want to be less fearful about things like taking the bus or going into a certain neighborhood or seeing teenagers down the block. Research on restorative justice from across the world shows that young people who go through restorative justice build empathy and consequential thinking. And they also tend to have a lower recidivism rate compared to their peers who are similarly situated who go through court. In DC, we've done some initial data analysis, and we also see a reduction in recidivism. But research out of the UK and Australia, rigorous research evaluations, seem to show that there is an even bigger recidivism improvement when restorative justice is used for serious violent cases as opposed to the lowest level cases. We also routinely do victim satisfaction surveys, and we find really high rates of victim satisfaction in the 90% range. And in fact, this is something that is consistent among evaluations of restorative justice programs around the country and around the world, that victims say that they're satisfied with the process, that they would do it again if they were in a similar situation, and that they would recommend it to somebody else. And so you have to ask yourself, well, if we continue to get poor outcomes from our current justice system for victims and in terms of recidivism and behavior change, why do we hold on to it? I think it's because our justice system was built for trials. All of those procedural protections that are written into the Constitution are brilliant where someone contests their guilt, where someone wants to go to trial. And so in that situation, we do want to sterilize the criminal event and limit the victim's role and silence the respondent or defendant and only let the attorneys talk. That's what our court system is for. Only we almost never go to trial. It's like a beautifully designed system for 5% of the cases that result in trial, but it's a terrible one for the 95% of cases that go to pleas. If the truth is contested, then trial is appropriate. But if the truth is not contested and the young person is willing to take responsibility, it's no longer a search for truth. It's about justice and accountability. And so in DC, what we do now is we check. So under the protection of confidentiality, our restorative justice facilitators speak with the young person after talking to the lawyer and the family and check about if they're willing to take responsibility. Because we know that when a young person is willing to take responsibility for what they did, if we as a system encourage them not to, we are making it less likely that that child will change their behavior in the future, and less likely that they will learn from their mistakes. And what I've seen in my office is that prosecutors understand this. After a prosecutor sits in on a restorative justice circle, which we let them as an observer one by one, that prosecutor will refer more cases to restorative justice, including more serious cases, instead of prosecuting. And many times when we invite an observer to sit in on a restorative justice conference, it could be a prosecutor, a judge, or a probation officer, they often say they can't believe that after the trauma of crime, people can see each other as human beings and come to resolution. And I worry that in courthouses, it is actually impossible to see people really as human. In restorative justice, we put a victim and offender and their supporters together in the circle, and they share personal things about themselves. They see each other, they talk to each other. That is about seeing each other as human. And a courtroom, we alienate people. A circle allows a respondent to trust that the victim is not going to attack them, and it allows the victim to trust the world again. I'll tell a story about the first time I sat in on a circle. not just a restorative justice conference, but a restorative justice circle. It was at the same school that I talked about earlier, Ballou Senior High in DC. And I had just started going to visit Ballou from the prosecutor's office to do some work there. And I brought 2 prosecutors from my office with me, and the 3 of us all came from work. So we're all dressed up in suits and ties and heels. And it was in the middle of the summer, and everybody else is in like jeans and t-shirts. And so that was awkward, but it was also awkward because the people who were there in this circle that we kind of crashed, they were all super tense because this was a new principal and she had been there for a year and she had just fired half of the staff at this big school. And this was the remaining staff, and they were all really suspicious and anxious and worried when we sat down for this circle. And then me and these 2 prosecutors showed up. We were randomly there. They didn't know who we were, what we were doing there, but we were invited to join the circle by the principal. So there was an outside facilitator, and she asked everyone to sit in the circle, and she asked an icebreaker question, and there were about 40 people. So it was a big circle. And then she asked us the first big restorative justice question. She said, "What is a challenge that you've been through in your life that's made you stronger?" Okay. So she says, "Okay, now it's your turn," to the person next to her. And that person gave some sort of safe answer, which I don't remember. And then it went to the next person, and that person passed, because you're allowed to pass, they tell you, if you don't want to answer a question. And so we're all like, I don't know if this is going to work. But then the third person, it came to them. And the third person told a story about growing up in the Midwest in a small town and coming out as gay to his parents when he was in high school, and that his parents rejected him and refused to speak to him, and he had to leave the home. And he got all choked up, and like we all got choked up. And then it goes to the next person, and then eventually it goes to somebody who tells a horrible story about how her husband was shot and killed in the neighborhood that she lives, which is also the neighborhood of this school, and how she felt like she wasn't going to be able to survive without him. And now people are sending tissues around the circle for her because she's crying and everybody's all emotional. It gets to another woman who's this like super tough as nails administrator, and she talks about this harrowing case. Something happened to her daughter. And then it comes around to us, and we all kind of tell our stories. And then at one point, we actually had to leave, me and the 2 prosecutors, like we had to go back to the office. We had a certain time we had to get back. And so we were like, I'm sorry, we got to go. And the facilitator was like, oh, no, that's fine. This is a good time for a break. Everybody can get up, go to the bathroom, stretch. And so we're getting up to leave. And the craziest thing happened. We're walking out to leave and saying goodbye. And then people from this circle who don't even know us come up to us and they give us hugs. We were total strangers to them. They didn't even know why we were there. But they felt close to us after this experience, and we felt close to them. And it was because the experience of sharing personal stories made perfect strangers see each other as human beings. And so that's something that we do in our restorative justice conferences. We prepare extensively with both sides, but in the actual conference, the dialogue with both sides together, this is the first thing that we do. We start with a couple of questions that allow people to be vulnerable. What's a challenge that you've been through in your life that's made you stronger? What is something that people assume about you that is not true? Who is somebody that you look up to and why? And who is somebody that looks up to you and why? Because when we share something personal about ourselves, and importantly, when somebody else shares something personal about themselves with you, you begin to trust each other. Sharing requires that you make yourself vulnerable. And when somebody shares with you, they're making themselves vulnerable. And it's a little bit like, your heart is opening up to the other person in the hopes that they will also open their heart to you. And when that happens, it's like you saying, I see you as a human being. So you can put some trust in that. And the other person is saying, I see you as a human being. And so you can put some trust in that too, which is not to say that I'm not angry or scared or hurt. It's not to say that I can forgive you what you did, or I will forgive what you've done. But it is an opportunity to say you did a really, really bad thing, but you are first a human being, and I see you. And so you are not the sum total of that one bad thing that you did. And so we do this in our restorative justice conferences before we start talking about the crime, because it allows people to see each other as human beings. and to have a hard conversation about something bad that happened. I observed a restorative justice conference that one of my facilitators had several weeks ago, and it went on for 2 hours. And at the end of it, this victim, who had actually been really badly hurt, so bad that he had to go through surgery, he said that hearing from the youth made him feel so much better because it made him realize that the world was not all bad. And the young person's grandmother said, she was so thankful to the victim. She was his sole guardian, the boy's sole guardian. And she said, I've been so worried that I was going to lose my grandson to this system. And she said to the restorative justice facilitator, my colleague, when we met you, you gave us hope. Brene Brown talks about the difference between shame and guilt. Shame says, I am a bad person. And guilt says, I did a bad thing. And she says that shame is highly correlated with addiction, depression, self-harm, and violence. But guilt is different. Guilt is inversely correlated to those things. Guilt has built into it a path to redemption because you are not the bad thing. And so you can try to make it right. What Brene Brown says is the ability to hold something you've done or failed to do up against who we want to be is incredibly adaptive. It's uncomfortable, but it's adaptive. This is how we learn from our mistakes. And this is the heart of restorative justice. But I believe that in courtrooms and courthouses every day, what we do is the opposite. Because no matter how kind you are to the respondent or their family, the very nature of court denies humanity. In California, there's a district attorney who once said that the criminal justice system is a recidivism machine. But I believe it's actually a shame machine. I'll tell another story. We had a case in which a young person tried to rob a woman, and he had a gun, and she resisted. And in the panic, he shot his gun, and the bullet grazed her body. And so a restorative justice facilitator was brought in and was asked to speak to the young person. And he immediately and effusively was remorseful. I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm so sorry. Please tell the lady I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. And then the facilitator separately goes and speaks to the woman, and she is totally traumatized and scared. But after our facilitator spends some time with her and she thinks about it, she said that she wants to do restorative justice. So the facilitator works with the victim, but over the couple of weeks that she's been working with her, the victim is still unable to talk about what happened to her on that day. And so the facilitator goes back to the boy, the respondent in this case, and says, typically we don't disclose anything that any side said to the other, but she asked him for permission in this case. Do you mind if I tell her some of the things that you've been telling me when I talked to her? And he said, yeah, that's fine. So she goes back to the victim and she says, I asked if I had permission to say this, and the boy said that I could, and he wants you to know that he's so sorry and that he hopes you're okay. And when the facilitator tells the woman this, she just breaks down sobbing. And from that point on is able to now talk about that day and that moment. Now, in this case, this was one of the cases that we had taken early on that was a very serious case. And in most of our cases, we never get to sentencing because restorative justice is an alternative to adjudication. But in that case, the case was already set for sentencing, and for various reasons, the case was going to sentencing, or what we call disposition, before the restorative justice conference was going to happen. It was an anomalous situation. So there is this, it's during COVID, so it's all virtual, that we're having this sentencing hearing. I wasn't there, but the facilitator, my colleague, was there. And there, everyone else was on video: the judge, the prosecutor, the young person, the victim, the defense attorney, the restorative justice facilitator, the boy's mom. And so in the course of the regular disposition, the judge turns to the victim and says, now it's your turn to read your victim impact statement. And in this case, apparently the victim had actually done a victim impact statement at the very beginning when she had met with the prosecutor at the very beginning of the case, before she'd elected to do restorative justice. So she takes out the victim impact statement that she had written, many weeks before or months before, and she starts to read it. And it's apparently a long statement, but at some point she says, you should be ashamed of yourself. I hope your mother is ashamed of you. And I hope your father, even if you if you even have a father, is ashamed of you. And then the judge turns to the boy and asks if he has anything to say, and he says no. Even though he had written a letter to the woman before court, he didn't read that letter. And later, the restorative justice facilitator reaches out and calls him. And now he says, I actually don't want to meet the lady. I don't want to go to do restorative justice. I don't want to do this anymore. And the facilitator later reached out to the mom, and the mom of the boy said that when the boy was taken, he was detained. And so when he was taken from the video room where he did the sentencing hearing back to his unit, he had to be moved to a special unit that day after court because he was put on suicide watch for several days. And in that case, the restorative justice conference didn't go forward because he didn't want to do it anymore. And I tell you this because it seems to me that even the things that we think are innocuous in our judicial process, even things that we think are just, like a victim impact statement, they can actually cause great harm if they exacerbate the feelings of shame when they're done without a sense of people as human beings. In court, we search for truth and justice ostensibly, but the way court operates, it feeds on mistrust. And in a restorative justice circle, there is a search for justice, but it's achieved through building trust. I have another last story to tell you. This is another case where I had a facilitator work on the matter, one of my facilitators. And this is a situation where 5 boys jumped a man on the subway platform that he was on. And in the scuffle, the man falls onto the rails of the train and he damaged his leg, but it puts him in great danger. The prosecutor offered pleas to felony assault down from aggravated assault in this case, if the young person, the youth, all of them did restorative justice with the victim because the victim had agreed to do it in this case. So our facilitator was given permission to talk with 4 of the boys. All 4 of them immediately admitted what they did. They expressed remorse. They're willing to talk to this man and say that they're sorry. But one defense attorney refused the deal, reasoning that if she went to trial, she would lose on felony assault, and therefore the plea didn't incentivize restorative justice enough. And our prosecutor didn't relent. She didn't want to change the plea. So one of the 5 boys in this case went to trial, and the other 4 boys and the victim waited for the trial to be over to be able to do the restorative justice conference. And so they go to trial, and at trial, the government had rested its case in chief. And after the government's witnesses had all testified, the judge called for a recess. And the boy, the respondent in this matter, he went to the bathroom. And there in the bathroom was the victim. And in the bathroom, the boy turns to the victim and says, "I'm really sorry for what I did to you." And so the victim comes back to the courtroom and he sees the prosecutor and he says, "You know, this kid I don't think is all that bad. He just said sorry to me in the bathroom." And the prosecutor's like, "What? Sorry?" Because she's thinking, I'm going to win this case. So she recalls the victim to the stand, asks him to relay what the respondent said as a statement against interest. And she was like triumphant, right? I've got this case. And the defense attorney is like deflated and super mad because she lost this case. There's an admission of guilt. And what ended up happening was that this was a battle between lawyers who both wanted to win in the theater of court. But what was lost was the fact that this victim was ready to forgive this boy and that this boy needed to apologize. Why would the lawyers be agitated when it's good for a child to apologize and it's good for a victim to move forward, to change his behavior, to learn from his mistake? This boy has to start with a genuine apology. And here, the lawyers wouldn't let it happen. Everyone operated from a point of mistrust. And that's what it is about our adversarial justice system. It makes people worse, victims and offenders alike. It does harm on both sides. In restorative justice, we give the victims a choice. They can choose traditional prosecution or restorative justice. And if you choose restorative justice, you can change your mind at any point and still not give anything up. They can still say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. And it goes back to traditional prosecution. And some victims do choose prosecution. But many victims choose the option that makes them feel safer, that allows them to regain trust in the world when their trust has been frayed. when I think about it, I feel like the central focus of the criminal and juvenile justice system is punishment, even though we say that it's about rehabilitation in the juvenile system. But the central component and focus of restorative justice is repairing harm. And I think that that's a really important thing to recognize, especially when we have to understand that we cause harm in our justice system to all involved. Now, doing restorative justice is not easy. It requires that we tap into a higher standard of humanity. It's not easy for the person who committed the crime, for the young person to admit what they did in front of the person who hurt them. It's not easy for the person who is the victim of crime. And it's certainly not easy for the justice system. It demands more of all of us. But if we have victims who are willing to do this, to look to repair the harm and to build empathy, then as a state, I believe that we should do this too, because we are public servants and we are empowered with the duty to make things better. And the juvenile justice system should have one single goal: to help children learn from their mistakes. Instead, we make them worse. At every juncture in our process, we stigmatize and shame and dehumanize. We don't even help victims heal or find closure where they're seeking it. And so we must acknowledge that we are doing this, and we must go back to first principles. How can we help children learn from their mistakes? Restorative justice is one way that we can. And if we believe in helping children learn from their mistakes and helping victims heal from crime, then we should be transforming our juvenile justice systems into restorative justice systems. And incidentally, New Zealand's entire juvenile justice system is restorative, so it's possible. We are all leaders of our justice communities. So justice is what we say it is. But what we have right now is not just. It is a situation where we stigmatize young people and we shame them and we degrade them. And then it is hard for them to learn from their mistakes and make better decisions in the future. Is restorative justice easy? No. Is it the answer for everything? No. Will some children fail? Of course. But I ask you to learn more about restorative justice, find local practitioners in your communities or your universities and invite them to your courthouses to brainstorm. Use your power to bring together judges and prosecutors and probation officers and defense attorneys, but also include young people who've been through the system and their families. And importantly, look critically at all of the parts of the justice system and process. Because if you open your eyes to it, you'll see that there are many ways that we're harming both victims and young people in the system. And then change that. Because now is the time to reimagine our juvenile justice systems. On the whole, juvenile crime is going down. There's more of a national consciousness about the harms of the criminal justice system, especially towards kids of color and poor kids. And we have an obligation as public servants who are entrusted with our most vulnerable and needy children to repair societal harm, to be restorative, and to seek children learning from their mistakes. So thank you for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions if folks have them.
Seema, there are several questions waiting in the chat.
Okay, I see some.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. I've got a couple that okay. What are the challenges for prosecutors participating in restorative justice? I think prosecutors have a lot of skepticism about restorative justice. They are worried that I've heard from other prosecutors' offices that some prosecutors feel like this is disrespectful to victims because it's asking victims to do something else when they were the victims of the crime. I've heard from prosecutors in my own office that they think that it is an easy way out for young people. And I think the response that I would have to both of those points is that we give the victims of crime a choice. And in our minds, it's actually very trauma informed to give somebody who's been through trauma, like a victim of crime, agency and choice. And so even if we talk to a victim and they say, no, I don't want to do restorative justice, we're kind of like, that's great. Actually, that's empowering to them too. And so victims can say, like, I don't think it's worth my time if they don't think it's worth their time, or I don't think this is what should happen to the young people, and that's fine. Prosecutors also think it's soft on the kids, and maybe it feels like it is, because I think that what we've done in this country is we've really conflated punishment with accountability. And we think, well, when somebody does something wrong, the only way that we're going to feel like they're accountable is if they're punished. But I think that that is conflating two different concepts. Like, true accountability is acknowledging you've done something wrong, telling the person that you hurt exactly what you did, answering their questions, expressing remorse, and then sitting down with them and coming up with things that you can do to make them feel better and to right the situation so it doesn't harm them, to harm anybody again. And that is actually what the research shows is better for behavior change. It doesn't look like punishment, but in some ways it's easier to do punishment. You don't have to say you're sorry to anybody. You don't have to face them. You don't have to hear how badly they were hurt. And I think when our prosecutors sit in on restorative justice conferences, they see that. They see that it's really hard for kids to be in that circle. And they see that victims get a lot out of the process. And that it really is about true accountability. That's my answer. What are the average number of cases that move to the restorative justice arena? That's a good question. It really just depends. And things have changed a lot in the few years that we've been doing this work. We started taking lower level offenses. We've moved into taking more serious offenses. I think at one point we determined that about 25% to 30% of victims decline to do restorative justice, which shows that a lot of them actually agree to do restorative justice, which we also feel. We are always surprised. Even my facilitators who do this work, we're always like, wow, I'm so surprised that this victim agreed to do this. So we have a lot of uptake with victims. On the other hand, we also have to make sure that the person who committed the harm is well suited for it. So when we speak to the young person, we're not only trying to see if they would rather go to trial, right? If they're contesting their guilt or they're willing to take responsibility, but also if they're going to be good in restorative justice. Because if they're kind of like, well, the person made me do it, or they shouldn't have done that, if they're going to blame the victim or shame the victim, then we're not going to put them in the situation to potentially re-traumatize a victim. And so then we will say, this case is not appropriate for restorative justice. So there are a number of cases that don't go for that reason. Who are the restorative justice facilitators employed under? So in our office, our restorative justice facilitators are employed by the Prosecutor's Office, our office. I'm their supervisor. We currently have 6 facilitators who are full-time trained restorative justice facilitators. They're not lawyers, but we are the only office in the country that has that. There are several DA's offices around the country that do send cases for restorative justice, but most of them send them to an outside community-based group that does the restorative justice. And that group contacts the victim and meets with the young person, then facilitates the conference. In our office, we do that in-house. How much money can restorative justice save the public over having a trial? Has there been a cost-benefit analysis? We haven't done one. I'm sure it's tons and tons and tons of money because of all the things that have to happen when a kid has to go to trial. But we haven't done the analysis. I'm confident that it would be a great amount of savings. Do you offer restorative justice for youth who are charged as adults? We actually don't. And that is in part because in Washington, D.C., we have this weird situation where we are not the adult prosecutor. We are the juvenile prosecutor. The adult prosecutor is actually the feds, the federal government. We have the U.S. Attorney's Office being our adult prosecutor in D.C. So we don't have jurisdiction over kids who are pulled up and charged as adults. So we don't use restorative justice for them. Have you ever used surrogates in place of an actual victim? That's a great question. For a little while, we were taking some cases. Our prosecutors, interestingly, when we've expanded into taking different types of cases, it's because our prosecutors have asked us to do it, which is crazy to me. But at one point, our prosecutors were saying, look, we have a bunch of these low-level sexual harm cases, and we don't feel like it's necessarily appropriate to prosecute these kids through the system. Would you consider taking them? And what they were talking about are cases like in schoolhouses, like in schools, where, say, like a boy is like groping a girl above her clothes multiple times or something like that. So it's not penetration, but it is a sexual harm. So we got our facilitators trained through various trainings, and we actually eventually started taking those cases. And what I found, I at the time was facilitating cases, and in some of my cases and some of the other cases that were like this, was that in most of those cases, the victim was a girl. And in those cases, the victim would say sometimes that they didn't want to be there. And so what we had them do was, we gave them a lot of options, but in many cases, they would write a letter about what they would say, and they would have their mom read it or their aunt read it. In one case, she wanted the facilitator to read it. And their supporters were still in the circle, as were the kids. So that's when we've used surrogate victims. Are you collecting data to see how the restorative justice conferences assist in reducing racial disparities? I guess that's what RED is. We are collecting data and evaluating the utility of restorative justice in reducing recidivism. And we also collect a lot of data and do these surveys with victims after they go through a restorative justice conference 6 months later. In DC, our racial disparities are so bad that almost everyone in our juvenile justice system is a kid of color. In fact, a poor kid of color. And so because of that weird situation, it's not that some youth who maybe are given restorative justice are not kids of color, they're white kids. It's that none of the kids in the system are white kids, frankly. And so I think that the racial disparity analysis is a little bit different for us. I'm not really sure what it looks like. What I believe is that our system is a dehumanizing one. And I think that there is a part of dehumanization which is about race. And so I think that restorative justice is an anti-racist way to hold people accountable for committing crime. And so I think it's deeply anti-racist. And the reason I kind of know that, or I feel that, is because I get calls sometimes from universities. I've gotten a few calls from universities who've reached out and said, can you help us build a restorative justice program at our university? Because it turns out that in universities, there is a lot of crime, right? There's like rampant underage drinking. There are sometimes assaults. There's a lot of sexual violence, sometimes low level, sometimes very serious. And in those settings, when somebody commits a crime, the university and the university community says like, oh no, we don't want our kids to have to go into the brutal criminal justice system. Like there's no way, because they have these bright futures and we don't want to ruin their futures. And I feel like it kind of hurts my heart when I hear this, because we should not want any child to go through a brutal system that is punitive and dehumanizing and shaming in order to learn from their mistakes. So why do we think that it's okay for in DC for our Black and brown kids? That's kind of something that always occurs to me when we talk about racial disparities. How do you and your colleagues learn about racial issues, and do they teach it in law schools in your area? I think that it's a good question. In DC, race is like palpable, like racial issues and racial disparity is palpable because we are, like kind of segregated, and there's a lot of poverty among our Black and brown communities, and among our non-Black and brown, non-Latino and Black communities, there's a ton of wealth. So it's like very, very disparate. what was important to me in building this program was that the facilitators that I hired, the people who are the ones who work with the young people and their families and the victims and prepare with them and then bring them together, it was really important to me that they reflected the community of kids who come through the justice system. And so that's one way that we address racial issues. I think it's important in part because, they work at a prosecutor's office, and so they need to build trust with communities that are typically very distrustful of prosecutors and the justice system, and they have to do that quickly. And so if they look like, the kids and their families, if they can be a role model to the kids, I think that that's an important way that we can address racial issues and be thoughtful about how we do our work. I hope that answered that question. I've found that a lot of, to answer your question, Mr. Biden, a lot of universities and law schools around me want us to come and speak about restorative justice. So I hope that they are talking more about these issues.
Well, thank you very much. Again, as a reminder, there will be a survey that will pop up. Please take the time to complete the evaluations. They have been very helpful in our planning. Seema, I just definitely want to thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us today and bringing this information to us, and the idea that we too can be a part of the change. Thank you all for attending, and don't forget to watch out for James Bell, who will be presenting August 25th to kick off our Red Conference year. Thanks again, guys.